Philanthropy Outlook study. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the fundraising school, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Jon Bergdoll. Jon is an associate director on the research team at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and he's led the publication of the Philanthropy Outlook study, looking ahead to the prospects for charitable giving in the coming years. And Jon, thanks so much for being back with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Always happy to talk.
So we want to be clear up front that when people fundraise, the most important factor is your relationship with your donors, understanding their philanthropic values, their philanthropic motivations, and how those intersect with the public service mission and the impact and the results of your nonprofit organization. That is always going to be paramount. But there's this important issue of the wealth effect of charitable giving and how do economic factors play in with the charitable giving decisions and the amount of charitable giving people can do at any given time. And that's what we're looking at with this most recent publication of the Philanthropy Outlook study. Jon, what are some of the key findings from this year's report?
Absolutely. So I would say the biggest finding, the top line findings for us are that we find that overall total giving, so the whole picture, individuals, corporations, foundations, the whole shebang, for 2024 and 2025 are both slotted to grow at about 4% after adjusting for inflation. This is right in line with long run averages, a little bit above, but not terrifically so.
So, Jon, what are some of the factors that you and your colleagues utilize to reach these conclusions?
Sure. So the Philanthropy Outlook, what makes it a little bit different from some of the other perspective sort of look ahead looks is that it's fully quantitative and based off of econometric models. We basically take all of the variables that we know from other work, whether that's Giving USA or other literature, even outside of the school, all of those variables that we know are related to giving and sort of produce the model that has the best predictive probabilities based off of the data from it. And those factors typically, are going to be pretty stable year to year. We've had some unusual years lately, but for the most recent two, the ones that really look like they're moving the needle the most are some familiar faces of, a couple measurements of wealth, whether that's net worth or whether that's looking at the S&P 500 as sort of a proxy for the market and for wealth, and personal income, how much, the availability of houses to give. These are to some degree kind of no-brainer ones, but, they have not necessarily been the biggest sort of movers in recent history due to, very unusual economic circumstances of the recent years.
So, Jon, people who've attended our courses at the fundraising school know, and I think this is in just about every one of our courses, that one of the strongest correlations in terms of the wealth effect of charitable giving is the S&P 500. That from January to December, when the market goes up, the following year, charitable giving tends to go up. Sadly, the opposite is true. When the market goes down January to December, the charitable giving the following year tends to go down. So I'm inferring if this study is forecasting a 4% growth in 2024 and a 4% growth in 2025, both after inflation, by the way, that we're assuming the market is going up. Am I assuming correctly?
Yes, of course. The S&P 500 is really closely tied to giving. And in the Philanthropy Outlook, it is assuming a relatively normal average sort of growth in the S&P 500. But of course, the S&P 500 represents one of those challenging elements where there's a lot of variability year to year, and big changes in that from expectations, whether that's upwards or downwards, is one of the conditions we talk about in terms of potentially changing that overall growth number, that 4% from what we would expect. So, if the market really overperforms in this year and next, maybe things will look even rosier. If, things look a little bit more dour, that 4% is not as likely to happen.
Yeah, this is just a forecast, not a guarantee, not even a prediction, just a forecast. And taking a look at economic data, forecasted economic data, and the potential relationship with charitable giving. Jon, I know that with our colleague Patrick Rooney, you've done some research in terms of how inflation can affect charitable giving. And you and Patrick, taking a look at existing research, found that when inflation is greater than 5%, that can have a chilling effect on charitable giving. Fortunately, in the last year or so, inflation has been moving in a good direction, moving lower, now down around 3% or so as we record this interview. Again, I'm glad I'm not you that I had to make this forecast. How did you think about inflation as you were putting this study together?
So for sort of the economic variables, we aren't the only people doing this sort of, we're the only people doing this sort of work for philanthropy in the specific way. But thankfully, in the broader economic world, there are lots of folks who want to look ahead. And we try to rely, when possible, on estimates being made by some of those larger organizations. And in the case of inflation, we looked at the personal consumption expenditures as sort of predicted by the Congressional Budget Office. And, in their terms, they are expecting that soft landing to, continue apace. And for inflation to stay, well under that sort of 5% signifier where models start getting wacky and things start going off the rails a little bit.
Of course, in 2023, so many people were predicting a recession. Even the leaders of the biggest banks are, here it comes. It's going to be this big hurricane, one of them said. And it's just going to be, how bad is the hurricane? Well, the hurricane never came, fortunately. And again, in this first quarter of 2024, so far, so good. Not great, not horrible. I'm seeing words like the Goldilocks economy and some of the national economic press that I'm reading. Again, you're trying to look 2 years out. How did the possibility or not of a recession, kind of play into this forecast of 4% growth each of these 2 years, 2024 and 2025, after adjusting for inflation?
Sure. I mean, as you mentioned, right now, the sort of median level forecast is for that Goldilocks level of not too robust, but not certainly not recessionary over the next 2 years. And again, we use the Congressional Budget Office values for the GDP growth, which are right in line with that of, I think, like between 2 and 3%. In a lot of ways, honestly, the economy and the predictions here remind me a lot of sort of the later Obama years of like 2014, 2015 of, well, those were sort of boring economic years and sort of, boring years in terms of philanthropy's growth. And for me, working on this and Giving USA, I miss those days. Those are easier to predict. But that's what this kind of reminds me of at this point. And, there's always going to be things that happen that are outside of the prediction. And it's just a matter of the scale of those things. Hopefully we don't have another, 2020 happen where things are completely off. But, right now, things look sort of baseline, which is nice.
Yeah. And baseline, again, without a recession, Giving USA tends to go about 5% in any given year. Even when we factor in recessions, the average is an increase of about 3%. And the forecast in this study for 2024 and 2025, after adjusting for inflation, is a 4% increase each year. Jon, I'm curious about wages. Did you and your colleagues look at wages in this regard? And wages have been going up about 4% on an annual basis. Our neighbors in the bottom quarter of the economic wage gain have been seeing some of the larger areas of growth. And that's not to suggest that they're on easy street by any means, but it shows you how widespread the wage growth is in the economy right now. Have wages focused into this forecast? And does that maybe also indicate maybe how charitable giving can be more broad-based across the economic spectrum?
Sure. I mean, so wages are sort of represented more indirectly, I would say, in Outlook, in that they show up mostly in terms of our measurements of personal income or disposable personal income. Those are the sort of equivalent variables that we use, which include wages, but also include other things like transfer income and things like that. And certainly that broad base, it's interesting with giving. That broad-based growth is not always going to show up on top-line results because of how top-heavy giving is. But where it might show up And this is not something the Philanthropy Outlook itself looks into necessarily, but where it might show up is in that sort of that donors down, dollars up, continuum that we've had for so long. With a little bit of catch-up wage growth at the bottom, maybe we do see, because most of that donor fallout has occurred on the bottom half of that economic ladder. So potentially we might see, nothing that's going to change, the pocketbooks necessarily in the short term of organizations, just due to the size of the donations, but it might, sort of point toward a more robust and maybe a healthier long-term outlook for organizations across the spectrum, especially those more reliant on donations from smaller donors.
Wonderful analysis, John. I appreciate you breaking it down in that regard. And of course, at the fundraising school, we emphasize that all gifts matter, all donors matter. And if our neighbors at kind of those early rungs of the economic ladder aren't donating, let's make sure it's not because we are not inviting them to donate. We shouldn't just focus so much on return on investment that we only are asking people of wealth to donate. It is a little bit more work. It's more of a volume strategy. But let's make sure we're inviting everybody across those economic classes. John, let me ask you, so 4% overall, are there any differences in terms of individuals, foundations, and corporations, or are they all at 4% in these next 2 years?
No, there's quite a bit of variance between sort of those the sources of the buckets of growth, what have you. With the strongest growth coming from, maybe not surprisingly, foundations. This is in part because of foundations. If you've been following a lot of the philanthropy news, there's been a lot of talk about how their asset base has grown to sort of unprecedented sizes. And there's just, with foundations, because of the 5% grant rule, in which they have to grant every year 5% of their assets, there's a direct correlation there between their worth and how much they're granting. And so we have foundations growing first by 10%, and then following that in 2025 by 5%. And so that net growth is quite a bit higher than that overall. In contrast to that, we do have a little bit weaker of growth with individuals, with about 3% each year. Over the last decade or so, individual giving has lagged the other forms of giving. And a lot of that is, as we talked about just a few moments ago, maybe the consequences of the dollars up, donors down. The dollars are still going up, but when you look at it in comparison to the other forms of giving, they do suffer a little bit of headwind, and it may be from that incidence, decline.
What about the corporate sector?
Corporate sector, relatively, also at 2% and 3%, so a little bit lower than individual giving. But corporations also represent a sort of surprisingly small percent of that overall pie. And every corporation is going to be different as well. So, one of the things we talk about in the Outlook is the fact that, kind of like what you said of know your donors, it's also a know your organization sort of thing, where these results are not going to be universal, even if they hold 100% true. There's always going to be some orgs that overperform and some orgs that underperform, and similar with corporate donors.
And again, for our audience, keep in mind that these forecasts are adjusted for inflation. And if you come to our fundraising school courses, we teach you should build inflation into your budget, which then builds inflation into your fundraising goal, which means if you're just matching inflation, you're actually coming out ahead even more in nominal terms. So make sure you're putting inflation into your budget forecasts with your nonprofit, which of course affects your fundraising goals and how you are doing from one year to the next. Jon Bergdoll, Associate Director of the Research Team at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And John, thanks again for being with us. You really have a gift to take the complex data and translate it into a very accessible format for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's always great to talk with you.
And the Philanthropy Outlook study is available on our college's website at philanthropy.iupui.edu. Scroll across the top toolbar, look for the word research, and you'll go to the research page and find the Philanthropy Outlook study. Now, A little bit over from research is professional development. That's where you find the fundraising school, a couple of dozen public courses leading to 4 different certificates. We can bring those courses or blend parts of courses together for you in our custom training, and can do that in person, online, in the United States, anywhere across the world. We have quarterly webinars and, of course, these weekly podcasts, all of our knowledge gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the 5th edition. All of this online at philanthropy.iuedu.edu/the fundraising school. Again, grateful to our guest today, Jon Bergdoll, and a podcast produced masterfully by Jennifer Boffman and Mike Anthony. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. You are now more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.